we should be live. Great. So thanks for joining everybody and welcome to the second of our Work Happy webinar series. This is where we're going to be talking about what it means for people to work happy in this new world that we live in today. We know that for each company and individual, this means something different, and Silicon Reef is all about helping organizations design modern workplace solutions that ultimately help people to work smarter and happier, especially during this troubling time that we're going through. And during this webinar series, we're going to host guest speakers in leading roles from companies and organizations that are looking to enable a shift in how the workplace is currently run and moving to what's called, I like to call a new normal. We invite these leaders to share stories from particularly over the last 6 months and what they're planning to do for the future of their workplaces. And I'm really pleased today to introduce James Donald, who's the Acting Associate Director of the Communications at the University Hospitals Trust, University Hospitals Dorset NHS Trust. I knew I'd get that wrong, James. I knew it was coming up. Now, there is a long title, but we're really excited to talk to you today about the change that's going on within the Dorset Hospitals that's recently been announced. So, James, welcome to the Work Happy webinar. Why don't you introduce yourself and give us an update on what's going on with the changes with the university hospitals and how the group has been formed, and just give us a little bit of an overview about your role as well.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Alex, and thank you very much all for joining us. So I'm 2 weeks into my new role as Associate Director of Communications for, I'll get it right as well, University Hospitals Dorset NHS Foundation Trust. And this has been formed by the merger between Poole Hospital and the Royal Bournemouth and Christchurch Hospitals. So these two big trusts in the east of Dorset have come together to form this new trust. The merger has been 9 years in the making. It was refused earlier, but eventually, after many hurdles, has gone through. So it's fantastic news for East Dorset and indeed for the region itself, because now the hospitals can start sort of reconfiguring and serving patients better. So this is all about patient benefit. That's why the two hospitals have come together. With all that, we now have the staff force have obviously come together. So suddenly we've got 9,500 staff. Which is a huge number of staff. We're just discussing, Alex. So my role is involved in both internal communications, bringing staff together, a lot about the vision, what our trust should be like, what it should be like to feel like to work in this trust, the new trust, but also external communications. The NHS has been in the spotlight like never before this year. There's a lot of scrutiny, correctly, of the NHS, a lot of interest from the public in the NHS. So my job is both internal and external.
Great, and with that, it sounds like you get a lot of variation between, the internal communications, which are really important to keeping morale up and keeping information flowing amongst internal, but also external with the merger as well. And I know I've seen a lot about the hospital on the news recently, and whether it was the Thursday evenings clapping for the NHS. And tell us a little bit about what that's been like and how that's been for people inside the hospital, and stories that you may have heard of where the clapping for the NHS in particular, and what that's been like for staff morale.
It's been fantastically beneficial. The whole sort of surge in love and support for the NHS was incredible, because it made such a difference to people. People were obviously working very hard and feeling under pressure. But to see the public support in that way, and we're very lucky. I was actually based on Royal Bournemouth that day, and there's a big area outside, and Dorset Police came and were fantastic with all the blue lights. And it was a beautiful evening. Quite early on, this was in about April, I think it was, and it made such a difference. And I spoke to staff who were there, who said they'd been, working for a long shift, wearing PPE, very hot, very constraining, very draining. But to come out and to see that with all the blue lights flashing, it made the hairs on the back of their neck stand up. So it was an amazing thing to happen. So all the public support, all the gifts that we received, we made sure that staff got them. We sort of created breakout rooms to share with staff. this was all so appreciated. Everything we got, even Lorraine, the lovely Lorraine, the TV presenter, sent down lots of hampers because one of our ITU consultants had been on the Lorraine show talking about a patient. So we had gifts from Lorraine, everyone from Lorraine to local charities. It was made a huge difference. So thank you, everyone who was involved.
Oh, that's really great to hear. And it's one of the things that, as a personal experience, my family, my kids absolutely love going out every Thursday and giving their appreciation. So no, I think it's great to hear how it's reflected across the hospital staff as well. So thinking about how internal comms has changed over the last few months and the challenges that you've faced, and maybe how you communicate has differed from in the past. Can you tell us a little bit about maybe the old ways of communicating internally for staff and patients versus what's going on today in the last few months and how you've had to adapt?
I think communications was very traditional in the past. A lot of reliance on, everyone loves a screensaver. They all say we want a screensaver. They don't say why they want it, but they want a screensaver. Lots of posters, because a lot of our staff are moving around. They're not desk bound, so they're moving around. They're going from ward to ward. They're caring for patients. They're not stuck at their desk, etc. So a lot of it was sort of posters and newsletters. So very traditional. But over the past few years, we've started using a lot more because we've realized that staff may not have access to computers, but they've all got a mobile phone. So we've started using social media a lot and sort of going a bit more digital with some of the communications we're doing with a staff app, etc. So we want to sort of make sure that we can share with staff what they want to know and what they want to hear, etc. That's more convenient for them. But then at the beginning of the pandemic, we've got a major emergency room just around the corner from here, or sounds very dramatic, but we're all sat in this major incident room. And suddenly somebody said, oh, hang on, this has got the medical director, the nurse, the chief nurse, everyone involved in running the hospital is huddled in a room. It's just very sensible. So that meant that suddenly we were all able to go back to our own offices, which sounds very strange, and then join through Teams. So Teams has been absolutely fantastic. It suddenly was adopted. People we knew of it. We hadn't really used it much. IT were kept saying this is going to be the future, and we said, yeah, IT, we've heard that before. But suddenly Teams became the great force. So it was a fantastic thing that we were able to do that, because I don't know how we'd have managed running the whole operations of the hospital if we weren't able to meet in such a way. It wouldn't have worked on sort of conference calls or whatever, traditional ways. So Teams has been absolutely fantastic, a godsend, and the fact that we can all have it on our mobile phones as well is brilliant.
Yeah, and I think you and the rest of the world, and it's been a great story for the NHS, and I think that the timing of the Microsoft announcements for rolling it out across the NHS has been fantastic. Thinking about some of the ways that, I think it's interesting you said about, oh yeah, IT, we've heard this before. New technology is going to change and revolutionize the way we work. It's going to make everything more seamless. How was the adoption of that? How did it go down amongst staff members, and not just the leadership team level, but cascading down to staff, and the adoption of things like people putting it on their personal mobile devices, perhaps? Have you got any experience and stories of that?
I think people have found it because at the moment, information became so capital. It was so important during this pandemic. People needed to know which wards were doing what was happening in what areas, etc. So everyone needed the information immediately. It wasn't something that they could rely on a weekly newsletter that I'll pick up bulletin on Monday or whatever. People needed information immediately. They need to know which areas were closing, where patients should be going, if there are any ward changes. So Teams are the fantastic way of doing that. You could start, there were teams within teams, obviously. So people would start creating their own, an intensive care team, whatever it would be, so they could sort of be in touch with each other and have their own conversations. So it's brilliant the way that you can have obviously organizational wide conversations, but then you can start narrowing it down. You can have all your different things. So I think that made a huge difference for people, because they could then use it. And obviously everyone's worried about security. So obviously you have to be careful what you were sharing, but the information that was shared was considered, at the correct level by our information governance team, etc. Because you obviously have to be very careful with patient details, etc. But for this sort of tactical information, that it was absolutely perfect for that.
And thinking about specifically internal communications and how Teams is great for collaboration. You're connecting people with each other. how do you see it changing the way that maybe internal communications can share messages and broadcast messages? Do you think it's a new communications channel for you to utilize?
It's definitely what I mean. With any communications, with any person working communications, I'll tell you, everything has to be multi-channel. You know, some people won't see it. Some people will still want to see a screensaver. Some people will still want to see a poster. So it's another channel, but it's a really powerful one. And we've been using a lot more video than we used to in the past as well. I mean, we've been very lucky. We've got a video guy based here, so we've been very lucky with that. But we've been doing a lot more. We used to have sort of chief executive briefings, and they'd be in the lecture theatre or in the restaurants or going to wards or wherever. But now we can record these and they can be shared much more widely. So we share them actually through social media, we'll share them through Teams, we'll share them through email, we'll share them through all the channels. But it's been a fantastic way of getting messages across and sort of giving updates of what's actually going on, because people are, you know, communications has become at the forefront of everything. It's been great to see the respect that communications has been shown, because people need to know this information. So suddenly, you know, we've been leading a lot of this, so it's been great.
And again, you mentioned how like there's teams within teams forming, and so like you've got, you know, ITU and you've got other networks forming within teams. And what sort of networks are being formed within the hospitals that perhaps previously, you know, maybe used to meet physically once a month or once a week? Are there any other networks that are forming and using Teams as a kind of engagement and collaboration channel?
I think a good example of this is actually our BAME network, which has been fantastic, because over the last few months, there's obviously been the awful events in America, Black Lives Matter, but there's also been a disproportionate, people from a BAME background have been disproportionately affected by COVID. In fact, two of our fantastic Filipino staff have been ill in our intensive care. So we know very much the effects this can have on staff. So the BAME network have used Teams. They've had some brilliant, in response to Black Lives Matter, they actually hosted a Teams event for all staff to sort of join in and listen and learn about their experiences, and it was incredibly moving. And we wouldn't have been able to hold the event because we couldn't have all sat in a lecture theatre listening to this, but really moving accounts of what it meant to them. But they've also, the BAME network, we've got an EU staff network, as we're discussing earlier, that we can't forget Brexit, and 10% of our staff are from EU, and it's been fantastic. They've used it a lot. And many other networks. So I think staff networks have really found it's a really good way of keeping in touch, but also a really good way of broadcasting their messages to other colleagues.
And do you think that with this kind of is a technology evolution for the NHS and the networks that it's creating, do you think that perhaps people who didn't have a voice internally previously, an employee, whether it's within a BAME network, how do you think the employee voice or the colleague voice has changed, and what influence do you think that's going to have over the coming months and years for giving people more of a platform, perhaps?
I think that's great. I mean, we always say glibly communications is a two-way thing, and often it's been very much just broadcast. And I think suddenly, with all this technology through social media, through Teams, through other things, it's actually becoming true. Communications is becoming a two-way thing. We are hearing a lot more from all levels of the organisation. So it's not just about broadcast from the top downwards and then worrying about will it go from management down to. It's very much giving people a voice and a platform. So I think it's a really, really important thing of spreading this, so we can hear a lot more and we can take in a lot more views. So I think working in my role, I hear a lot more from around the organization than perhaps I would have done, you know, a few years ago.
And do you think that's enabling you in your role to perhaps target your messaging? Because you're actually able to listen to the voice of what's being said, and you're actually saying that's a really important topic. How is it influencing your maybe internal campaigns that you might schedule throughout a year, whatever they might be? But are you adapting the way that you're running campaigns or communications to the voice of the employee?
Very much so, and we have to adapt and be flexible and be adaptable, because that's what communications is all about. I mean, we don't act in a vacuum. We act as sort of part of the organization. We have to be under the skin of the organization and react in that way. So if people have got concerns such as about Brexit, we need to be reflecting that. We need to be talking about Brexit. We need to be finding out, supporting staff when they're applying for their I've completely forgotten the word now, but so that they can stay settled status that one. We need to be helping them with that. We need to be supporting their families. So yes, very much so. We're finding it incredibly important for choosing what we're doing, because we need to reflect what's going on in the organisation. We can't create anything. We're there to help reflect and support.
And with that, I think one of the things that, technology is a fantastic enabler for the communications and connecting people. But personally, and this is speaking from my own experience, I'm finding that since I'm not traveling to an office so much anymore, or not meeting physically with people anymore, I've got this always on mentality at the moment, and Teams on my mobile phone, whether it's Teams on my laptop. And for me, in my role and what looking after Silicon Reef and Silicon Reef's employees, I'm in continual communication with my employees. But at the same time, if I'm a doctor or a nurse and I've had a really tough day dealing with COVID patients, and how are the hospitals and your experience of looking after your staff well-being and making sure that they are able to create that separation between being connected and being communicated to and communicated with and collaborating with colleagues? How is the hospital kind of helping draw a line to say, this is your working life, but make sure you're getting that life balance correct? And how are communications supporting that, and what's being done?
I think it's a very difficult thing. I mean, it depends what sort of, there are so many different roles in the NHS. I mean, as I say, there's 9,500. Obviously, there's not 9,500 doctors and 9,500 nurses. There's so many different roles. So from some of the frontline staff, I mean, they do very long shifts. Some of our nursing staff is 12.5-hour shifts. So the last thing you want them to be doing when they get home is to be sitting on their phones worrying about a latest email or what they have to be doing. So we're very keen to sort of showcase and highlight all the staff support that we offer, and sort of put staff well-being as number one. We sent out a message this week about something, because if we don't look after ourselves and we suffer and aren't at work, then we can't support other people. So we really need to look after our staff, and well-being is number one at that. So we're just refreshing our intranet, which is, we started as sort of a COVID space on the intranet back in earlier this year. Obviously, over the months after that, sort of bits have been added on, and it's like a house that suddenly had a new extension and then another bit in the 60s, and it looks an absolute mess. So we need to sort of strip it right back. And so we're talking this morning about what are the fundamentals of that? What do we need to make sure is at the forefront of that? And one of the things at the forefront is staff support. So that is one of the things they can find most easiest, so they know where to go to. So it can be showcasing where they can go to. We've talked about breakout rooms. We've got these breakout areas, and we're developing more again, where they can go if they need to talk to someone, where they can go if they need help with finance, where they can go. So we need to make sure that is very much at the forefront. So we want to show staff that they are supported, and that's really one of the fundamental things of what we've been doing over the last few months, is really using comms as a way of getting the messages of support out to our staff.
And you mentioned that obviously comms is about having a multi-channel capability, and the intranet in many organizations around the world is a communications method. It's not always the primary communications method, but it's actually it's becoming, and as a Microsoft partner, we're seeing more and more people coming to us saying, we want to revamp our intranet, we want to deliver a new intranet. Thinking about the intranet and how you go about restructuring that project that's going on. I don't know how involved you are in that project itself, but I know a lot of internal comms are very focal to how the intranet is run. How are you gathering up kind of all of the employee voice and their ideas about what they want to see on the intranet, and how are you kind of as comms structuring that as and the revamp project? I'd be interested to hear a bit more about that project itself.
I think with these things, because often you'll find that senior managers may have an idea about what staff want, and then when you speak to staff, actually that's not what they want. They want this. So it's finding the balance between the two. Because sometimes senior staff will think this is a very important message. Everyone needs to know that this person's been employed to that role, and you think, well, is that really important? So it's finding the balance of what actually is important to the people who are actually using the intranet. So it's really a question. It's the comms basics. It's back to the basics of what are you actually trying to achieve? What is this going to achieve? How will this make someone's life different? And then we can work out what the best way of doing that is. Because unless you've stripped it down to that, then you might as well just send out, and these are the thing that everyone needs to think, send out an all staff email, and that's fine, that's communications done. That's obviously not how communications is done, because that might be read by 3 people. You're not measuring it, you're not recording it, you're not knowing what effect it's had. So we really just strip it back and work out what staff want. And what staff want, as we know, because we do many surveys of staff, is that they want to know where the support is, and they want to know that they're supported. And they want the information really quickly and clearly about where they're meant to be, what they're meant to be doing, and which wards are closed, whatever, that's information that people want. And we do there's a lot of staff surveys done throughout the year. There's a national staff survey. We do our own internal quarterly staff surveys. There's also a lot of cases where we actually go out into the wards with organisational development, who are fantastic, who go out and speak to people. There's the network, so we get very rich information from people about what they want. So we can then blend all that together. And this is, again, the communications team is we can't create this. We have to reflect what's going on. So we can blend it all together and then create and then we can change it as well. If it's not working, these things aren't set in stone. They can change. And that's why, for instance, we're suddenly, when things go all messy, you can say, right, let's strip it down again. Let's find out what the fundamentals of it are. What are the 5 things that people need to see when they open up the intranet? What do they need to see? And immediately, and you can also measure it by, you can see which pages are most read, and that some of the information will be based on that as well. So there's many different things that can be used to actually get to the final thing.
And I think that in my world, as a professional services company delivering technology solutions for the benefit of customers, it sounds like you guys are taking exactly the same approach as we do, data-led, looking at the analytics, speaking to people. It's all about what the people would really want to hear and understanding it. What's the key thing for them to understand? Is it about wards being closed? Is it about announcements that are coming from the CEO, perhaps about a merger and how it's going to impact them? But thinking about the patient side of things and how communications with patients might have changed as well, like actually people on the wards, and is that something that you're seeing an evolution of how hospitals are actually changing the way they communicate with patients as well?
I think patients have been very interesting because earlier on this year, there was obviously the fear of being in a hospital. And suddenly, for instance, our emergency departments weren't being used. I was in our acute medical unit, probably in April or something. And there was a real worry about where were the patients that should have been in the acute medical unit. The people with with cardiology problems, people with strokes, all these issues, but they weren't there. They shouldn't have been so badly affected. So a lot of our patient communications has been showing how hospitals have adapted to the new normal. You mentioned it earlier. Have adapted to make sure there's different. It sounds an awful NHS glib thing, but pathways. So when you come in, you'll be in the right pathway for you, and you'll be as safe as possible in that pathway. Because we want to make sure that patients are using the services correctly. So we don't want someone coming into A&E with a poorly thumb, because that's not appropriate. There are other places they can go into. But if somebody has got chest pains and is having serious problems, they need to be coming here. So a lot of our patient communications is about showing what we're doing to help support patients, and also helping to showcase where they should be going to for other issues. So we were lucky, we did a nice piece with the BBC, came in and did a thing on eye surgery, because some operations you can put off, but eye surgery, you'll lose your sight, so you can't put that off. So a young guy, asthmatic, and had a tennis ball in his eye. And pressure was building, and this would eventually caused him to go blind. So he had to come in and have this operation, but this was quite early on. So he was obviously nervous about, well, I don't want to go into hospital. It's I'll catch COVID and I won't worry about being blind. So we sort of showed with the BBC how his pathway was and how he was protected and what he felt. And it was great because he actually was absolutely brilliant patient, because he was interviewed by them before his procedure and after his procedure. And he also allowed the BBC to film his procedure, never going to eye surgery. It's ghastly. But it was an amazing story. And that's the sort of story that we want to be telling of how we can support and help patients.
Oh, yeah. It's a good story, and for somebody who's a bit squeamish about eyes, I looked
at the big screen. Like, oh.
Yeah. One other thing that I think we've touched upon when we talked previously was around how a lot of the NHS staff in the hospitals, they don't have access to a computer. They don't have access to, access the intranet, maybe even access Teams. How do you address that challenge, and how is that change from perhaps that you, like you said, you all physically used to get together in a room and there used to be like a weekly or a daily briefing, or people on a ward who don't have access to a computer and they're not allowed their phones with them perhaps. How has that changed, and how do you see that evolving in the future as well, for how communications are done on wards?
Yeah, I think we're very lucky with wards that we know every ward, they will have a daily briefing themselves. So in the past, for instance, theatres used to have a briefing, a huddle, they call it, at 8 a.m. So if there was something really important, we could go along to theatres at 8 a.m. and there'd be lots of theatre staff all in their blue scrubs, and we could talk to them there. Obviously, that's slightly changed because people aren't all huddled together, even in clinical settings. But we know that they will be having a briefing of some description, and staff are actually using different ways of doing it. So, for instance, our emergency department has got a WhatsApp group briefing, which is brilliant. So we can sort of plug into that. So we've got sort of a network of all the different departments and what they do to help brief their staff. So the trick is obviously finding the person who's pushing the buttons, and then you can sort of feed into that and tap into that. So it's about building up a network around the hospital so that that you can sort of, the message can be disseminated throughout the hospital, rather than just relying on one joint staff briefing or whatever. But then you also do, we talked about it as well, you do the layers. So you do that layer, you'll do the joint staff briefing, you'll do the CEO's video that's on Twitter. As I mentioned, social media, staff are using it much more, so we can share those sort of messages on that. So it's down to the hand-to-hand level, but up to the very top level as well. So it's just doing all the different levels and making sure all the different levels are ticked off.
No, that's really interesting. I just want to say we're coming up to half an hour in. I just want to invite anybody to start using the Q&A. And we're looking to open up Q&A in about 15 minutes time. So if you have any burning questions for James or myself, please go ahead and put it into the Q&A. So James, just thinking about the challenge ahead of you and bringing together 9,500 people, I think you said, as part of this merger. The scale of that communication is obviously going to be a challenge. Can you tell me a little bit about the work that you're doing now? And I know you said you're only 2 weeks into the role, but what are you doing now that's perhaps different to how you would have done pre-COVID times, and you're planning for that activity of communication channel? Or maybe it's not different. Just be interested to hear.
I think one of the exciting things is I talked about how we have to reflect what's going on in the organization, and we're very lucky to have organizational development team here who are brilliant, who've been doing a massive piece of work over since before Christmas last year, on sort of doing the vision and values of the new organization. So I'm very excited about this because I think this is we've got an opportunity, because the problem with two organizations, there's always been a bit of sort of rivalry that Bournemouth think themselves this and Poole think themselves that, and there's always been Poole do it that way and we do it that way, whatever it is. So we need to sort of get away from that and show that we are one trust, 3 sites, 1 trust. And that's been the big thing that wakes me up in the middle of the night with so many staff. But I'm seeing as sort of like the Trojan horse to this is being the work that organizational development have done with the sport of communications, in sort of really getting under the skin of the organization and finding out what matters to staff. What does it feel to work here, yeah, that one. But also what matters to staff. So with that, at the moment, it's going to workforce committee, I think, today. It's going to the senior leadership team on Friday. It's going to the board meeting next week. So once these sort of vision and values have been signed off, I see this as being something that we can really piggyback on and put it across all our communications and start bringing it together, and that, I think, will be the way forward for the communications team.
I can see that being a challenge, and again, not just for the NHS. Whenever I've seen organisations come together through merger or acquisitions, there's always these challenges, and bringing together mission, vision, and values and purpose of an organisation is always a huge challenge. How do you think the CEO messaging will change? Because you mentioned there's a lot of video and a lot of things being done through social now. Do you think the main channel will continue to be video for that, and that's the best medium to reach the audience?
I think it has to be at the moment, because of constraints on what she can do and where she can be. I think video will be very good. I think, as I said, we're just about to launch a new staff app for all. It's another part of it all, so that will reflect the vision, values, etc. But also we can put out push notification, her video can go on that as well, obviously, and messages on that. So I think that will be really important for her to build up her sort of identity across all sites. Not everyone will know, but she's been very clever, and I like the fact that she's doing. So, for instance, this week we're filming in. I talked about the Our unit earlier on. She's filming. She does sort of during her bi-weekly films, or whatever. She'll focus on an area. It means that she gets to meet staff. She finds out. So before we go, I've sent a questionnaire to the department saying, how do you feel about this? How do you feel? To get a quick straw poll of the department, see what they've been doing. And that's reflected in the video. So it means that she gets to meet staff. It means they get to meet her. And it also means that she's getting sort of a snapshot of different departments. So she's doing this around all the sites to sort of get a feel of what's going on. But also it gives staff, they now have, know who she is. I'm sure most of them did anyway, but it's a really good opportunity for that. So I'm really keen that we carry on doing that and supporting that, because I think it's a big part of the whole communications package.
And I think one of the things that I think video in particular as a medium, it makes it more personable. Like you said, it makes you feel like you know who the person is before they're turning up. Do you think also with the evolution of maybe using more video and particularly using social media, maybe, or the other communications channels internally, do you think staff and employees will be more open to asking a question or to challenging something? And do you think that's something that's being welcomed by the CEO, perhaps? Because maybe it was almost like you said, as a broadcaster, this is what we're doing and where we're going and why we're doing it. And maybe people are being given more of a voice to come back and raise that and say, actually, guys, really good feedback from this part of the organization. We're adapting, we're changing. How do you think that's going to change the way that maybe the interaction between staff and a CEO is going to happen within the trust?
I think it's hugely important. I mean, we're very lucky. Debbie, our CEO, is very keen on this openness. So she's really supportive of staff asking questions. She's also much more open to sort of talked about media earlier on, but she's happy for Hugh Pym to interview her on the news. She's happy to be on the Today programme. She's happy to be doing these events. We have a joint staff briefing on Teams, funny enough, and there's sort of Q&As on that. She's happy to take the questions, you know. So I think she's very open, and it's really fortunate because some CEOs I've worked with, it's not been quite such an open relationship with staff, but she's happy to support. We've got a Freedom to Speak Out Guardian, which is a fantastic role and a brilliant person doing it. So she really wants to make sure that we talked about the communications are two-way. She wants to know what's going on in the organization, so that when she's walking around going on these visits, she knows what's going on, what people are worried about, what people are concerned about. And you can often only find that out when walking around and talking to people. I mean, I walked from the car park today with a senior matron who was telling me about how staff were, and how he felt about the staff and how they were feeling about, and that sort of information you can only get sometimes when you get out and meet people. So she's really keen to do that and does a lot of it, because obviously a very busy diary, but is you know, really supports it. So we help set it up and film it, obviously, and edit it all together. So it's a good thing to be doing.
No, it sounds great. And yeah, no, I like the idea of that role that's like freedom to speak, and there's somebody who's out there advocating it as well. It's a really interesting role. And actually leads me on to my next question, and thinking about any pearls of wisdom that you'd like to share for any other NHS communication colleagues who may be watching this and feeling under pressure, and maybe they don't have that role. I don't know whether it's a general role that's in every hospital, but that sounds to me like a great idea if there isn't one. Are there any other things that you wanted to pass on before we move to Q&A shortly?
I mean, I'm very lucky that I've been working, so during lockdown, I've been working here every day. I've been working in the hospital every day. And I know that hasn't been possible for all NHS communications people. So, but it does mean that I will meet somebody on the way to the car park. I'll meet someone at the photocopier, or I'll meet someone. I met one of our senior matrons who's been doing the flu jab. So I was able to have a chat with her about the flu jabs. How's it going? How's staff take up this year? Because that's a really important thing that we sort of work with, is especially this year of all years, flu jabs. So I'm lucky that I'm able to get out and about and see what's going on. So I'd say to NHS, if you can do that, brilliant, make sure you do it. But if not, set up some informal times to chat on whatever, and just have a coffee with somebody online, and just, you know, for no reason apart from having a coffee online, just to chat about how it is in their ward or how it is in their department. So I think that sort of information, the more of that communications people can have, the better they will be able to perform. So it's all about being a sponge to everything and picking up things, and then you'll suddenly get a connection. You'll think, oh, shouldn't we be doing that? Or for instance, the R unit, you know, it was just from a conversation with Minnie, one of our Filipino staff, talking to her, I then sort of worked with her, and then we got you know, the BBC in to do a special report on the Filipinos and how they've been badly affected by COVID, and that led, as part of that, she's now been awarded the British Empire Medal, which is fantastic for the work she did. So those sort of things, opportune conversations, but you don't have to have them face to face. You can have them online as well. So it's setting them up and setting the time aside just to have, you know, a 10-minute coffee with somebody, and meet people from a different area if you can. And we do another thing which is very good. The library organise it, randomized coffee dates type thing. So you put your name forward, and they'll come back saying, right, at 11 o'clock on Tuesday next week, you're going to have it used to be physical, you'd go to the cafes, but now it's online. You'll have a 15-minute chat with this person who you've never met, and you know nothing about what they do. And I saw on Twitter yesterday some comments about it, and people saying this is, you know, they've now got lifelong friends from this. So it's those sort of things really important to do.
I think it's one of those things that human interaction is on the decline at the moment, because we can't physically be together, and unless you're actually obviously in a hospital. And you mentioned to me earlier on, James, that you're in the hospital today, lucky enough to physically be in the hospital, but actually when you get together and have Teams meetings, you used to physically be in a room, but now you're all in your individual offices coming together. And for us as an organization, we're all working from home, but actually there's people spread around the country in their own houses, or perhaps in an office one day a week, perhaps. But yeah, a really interesting insight as to how, because of social distancing, you can't physically all get in the same room, and you're maybe in the same building, but maybe you will meet at the coffee machine incidentally, but have the interaction at the time. No, it's pretty interesting insight. Thank you. Just looking at some of the questions that are coming in. So we do have a question coming in. So with 9,500 people coming together, how have you managed the team to roll out the new communications plan, and who are your key leaders or influencers in carrying this out, other than yourself?
Thank you very much. So that's a really good question. I mean, we've got at Hospital, we've got a thing called it started at Royal Bournemouth, but now it's coming across both trusts. A thing called Change Champions. It sounds very dramatic, but they've been working with organizational development and working with communications. They've been fantastic at sort of getting the information out of the organization that will help the vision and values and everything, but also as sort of putting it back into the organization and sort of sharing what's going on, etc. We talked about earlier that we sort of know, say Ward 14 or something, I know who the sister is there, I know who'll be doing the huddle. So it's working with that sort of network as well, that we can make sure that the information goes through the wards themselves. So it's drilling down to the levels. Often in the past, there used to be a thing where you would have a senior staff briefing, and you would brief the senior staff, and they'd all come together. This was many years ago. And then you'd expect the senior staff to all go and it to percolate down. That often, the information would just stick at that level. It never got down lower. So I think communications team, all our responsibilities is to sort of get down there ourselves. So we have to be doing it and not just rely on the email to all, senior staff. We have to be doing it ourselves in different ways.
And just off the back of that, inspired me to ask a little bit around with the rollout of Teams that happened and those change champions, I think you called them. Were they advocates as part of that transition to Teams or implementing new technology? Because I know you mentioned earlier, this is your first day with your new laptop and Windows 10 and Microsoft 365 is being implemented across the organization. How does that look in terms of a transition and a change management and adoption? Is that through change champions as well?
Yes, I think change champions, but also we've got a very positive and proactive sort of IT team who have been absolutely amazing. And they say that they've had their time in the spotlight. I talked about communications having their time in the spotlight, but suddenly IT was, whoa, what's going on here? They weren't used to it. They were sort of out of the cupboard, and they were absolutely amazing what they did, because the work that they put in to sort of get this across the whole organization in double quick time was absolutely fantastic. But also we work very closely with our IT team on things like the internet. That's developed in-house as well. So they've had to bring together, 2 hospital trust websites and bring that together. So the IT team, from everything from the Teams rollout to the Office to the Windows 10, but also to the actual physical labor of creating a new website. They're absolutely amazing and fantastic.
Oh, thanks, James. That's good insights as well. Another question that's come in, is your communications plans specific to the university hospitals, or is there messaging coming down from a larger group of the NHS across the country?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that comes from somebody working in the NHS, but certainly at the beginning of March, there was very much a move from NHS England that communications, especially external communications, would be everything would be run through NHS England, etc. So, and that was quite a negotiation. I mentioned QPIM coming recently, but we had ITV back in April, and that was a lot of negotiation with NHS England. So NHS England are definitely playing a much bigger role in our communication decisions, etc., than perhaps they did before COVID. So yes, definitely, it's not just coming from, although we're a foundation trust. So in the past, we were able to act a lot more arbitrarily, but now definitely there's more pressure from outside to make sure that we're doing things in line with the whole national picture.
Thank you very much. I have a question from Fran Bond. So do you use your internal comms channels to signpost support resources to your frontline staff? Fran volunteers for Shout and frontline staff. who find themselves in a sort of crisis, and they're encouraged to contact Shout and Frontline staff. Fran would love to know if you promote this type of service internally. And as a side note, she just wants to say that she's also using Chat Roulette too, and it's great.
Brilliant. Well, that's brilliant. Yes, very much so. We do Signpost because that's what we talked about, how now that we're sprucing up the intranet and getting it ready for whatever's going to happen over this winter, and the sort of the feeling is this winter is going to be not good. So we need to get our house in order now, or we've been getting our house in order already. But very much so, I'd be very interested to hear from if you could pass on an email or something. Please send my email. Or I'm very easy to find. I'm on the internet, so it's just james.donald@uhd.nhs.uk. But please do drop me a line, and I can definitely share it, because we've got, as I say, we've got occupational health as well, and HR, and so we're lucky to have such a great support network. So this could be something that would be absolutely fantastic for that. So yes, please to forwarding on to me.
Fantastic. And do you foresee any resistance to the new communications plan on being on a system such as Teams, especially since every department and team have had their own way of communicating up till now? And how do you ensure adoption of such a new communications plan?
I think adoption sounds a bit dramatic. We're not sort of mandating anything. Nothing's mandated. I talked about multi-channel. So if people have already got their own ways, I talked about the emergency department have got their WhatsApp group, and it makes a massive difference to them. When I speak to them about it, and they said about, somebody sent something, and there's a lot of pressure these people are under. So they need to find the best way, what works for them sometimes. So I can't mandate. I don't want to be involved in their WhatsApp group. I don't want to be telling them what they can or can't do in their WhatsApp group, because I think that would be wrong, and I think it would make they're under enough pressure without me bothering them. But what I will do is offer them support or information to feed into that. I think we wouldn't be mandating, we wouldn't be changing, but we would offer them the tools to help them in any way, and the information to help them in any way that we can. So we're more supportive than mandatory.
Yeah, that sounds great. Another question that's come in, Fran is interested to hear your experiences of communicating across two different and perhaps even competing organizations that have merged. To her, it's key to mind that everyone is given the opportunity to feed in their opinions, concerns, etc. What's your experience of that, and how are you planning for it, James?
Well, it's week 2, Fran. So it's but it's been something that's been going on, and we've been one thing that we did find that with COVID is that we very much came together as comms teams, because a lot of teams were merging pre-merger. So the comms team, we already had one sort of central messaging, because we had a joint CEO for almost 2 years now. So a lot of this has been happening in advance of the actual merger date. But we need to make sure, I talked a lot about the vision and values and that work, and how that's actually reflective across all the sites and across both organizations, because it's finding about somebody once said it's like the Hovis thing, it's the best of both. That's what we want to be doing, is bringing together the best of both. And the way that OD ran their sort of question it's called an AI, or Appreciative Inquiry, apparently, is when you try and find out what do you really like about working here, what makes you happy, as opposed to what do you want to change. So that sort of approach has been taken to get the best of both, to find out, and that will be going forward. I talked about a Trojan, this will be my Trojan horse, but I think it'll be really important to bring the teams together, because I work across all sites, and I still, when I'm at another site, people say, oh, you do it so differently there, but actually I often reflect back, actually we don't do it, it's not done differently. And I mustn't say we, because that's, if we're going to get rid of the word we, but it isn't done differently over there. In fact, it's done very similar to this. So it's highlighting how similar we are, what joins us as opposed to what brings us apart.
That's a great answer. And I think on that, and with this we mentioned about the working happy and bringing people happy together as an organization. I think I'll draw this to a close because we have no further questions, but just want to say thank you very much for your time today, James. I appreciate it. It's a really busy time for you, and particularly with the merger, but also everything else that's going on in the hospital today. So thank you so much for your time. It's a really enjoyable conversation, and I'll put you in touch with anybody that's following up as well. And thank you very much for all of those that watched today. And yeah, thanks very much.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Cheers.